Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you on the debate organized by the Center for Totalitarian Studies of the Pilecki Institute. And the topic of the debate is going to be the destruction of the cultural heritage of Ukraine. And I think it's very important to shed some light on this very tragic aspect, because it's one of the practices of the totalitarian regimes, not only to eradicate certain groups of people, but also to eradicate their cultural identity. And our experts are going to give you very insightful knowledge about that topic today.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be a moderator of today's debate. My name is Patrycja Grzebek, and I'm professor at the University of Warsaw. My particular pleasure is that this debate is today organized together with fantastic scholars and experts in the area. We have with us two experts who are with us online, and this is Dr. Kateryna Busol. Kateryna, we welcome you very warmly. Kateryna is a Ukrainian lawyer and associate professor at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And recently you could see many articles published by Kateryna in academic journals, but also in newspapers. I think that she does a lot, not only to understand the problem, but also to warn the public opinion what is going on in Ukraine. She is focusing in her research on weaponization of cultural heritage, conflict-related sexual violence, and the question of genocide and Ukraine transitional justice. Together with us is also Dr. Joseph Powderly. Dr. Joseph Powderly is Associate Professor of Public International Law at the Krotus Center for International Legal Studies of the Leiden University. And Andrzej, I think you can agree with me that this is one of the best centers of international law, so we are very happy that we have you, Joe, with us, especially that Joe managed to edit and publish recently, together with Dr. Amy Strecker, a book, Heritage Destruction, Human Rights and International Law. And Joe did deal with the problem of destruction of cultural heritage in Ukraine, so definitely would be able to tell us much more about this topic. And last but not least, here present in Warsaw, together with us is Dr. Andrzej Jakubowski, who is assistant professor at the Institute of Law Studies of the Polish Academy of Science. But it must be stressed that Andrzej served as the chair of the Committee on Participation in Global Cultural Heritage Governance and is rapporteur of the Committee of Safeguarding Cultural Heritage in Armed Conflicts. Andrzej is also an author of the report prepared for the European Parliament's Committee on the Protecting Cultural Heritage from Armed Conflicts in Ukraine and Beyond. This report was published in 2023. And Andrzej also published several monographs and commentaries related with the protection of cultural heritage. Unfortunately, the question of the destruction of cultural heritage is not it's not something which ended. It's the ongoing crime which take place in Ukraine. And perhaps you could hear that just a few days ago, we could observe that the State Academy of Decorative Applied Arts and Design was attacked, was destroyed. And this was commented by many people of culture who cannot, in fact, understand why this war looks like this, why this kind of buildings, why the cultural heritage is attacked. And that's why we would like to try to explain what could be the reasons and also what kind of tools we have to protect cultural heritage. We would start with the very general question, because when we hear about conflict in Ukraine, we have in our images the destroyed buildings, but also stories about terrible crimes, suffering of people, millions of people who had to leave Ukraine, and millions of people who are in Ukraine and still suffer from the hostilities. And usually we focus on these pain, on the suffering of the people. And that's why sometimes we are wondering whether there is a point to discuss the question of destruction or protection of cultural heritage, that maybe there is no point to talk about it where people are dying. So Andrzej, if you could just start and tell us whether this is really meaningful or maybe this is marginal issue and not so much relevant.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for this introduction, and also for this question. And I'm very grateful to the Pilecki Institute for organizing this debate on the important topic and very frustrating topic. And obviously, destruction of heritage is not only about the destruction of built heritage, of building monuments. It is a serious crime, especially when we talk about intentional destruction, some deliberate destruction of cultural heritage, because this is the crime that affects communities, groups, individuals, so affecting human beings, and also as very often underlined by different UN organs, is also a threat to international peace and security. So this is not only the matter of destroying monuments. It's a matter of human rights. Is a matter of global peace and security. And also when we think about a number of documents of international organizations, of global organizations like UN and UNESCO and UN Human Rights Council, they constantly underline that that intentional destruction of heritage is not only a violation of international humanitarian law rules, but also can amount at the gross violations of human rights. And if we think about the approach taken by the Human Rights Council, so and also by different international tribunals, also the intentional destruction, the destruction against certain important heritage, not only built heritage, but also intangible aspects of cultural life, can amount as evidence of genocidal intent against a given group, a given community. So this is of course this crime, these acts cannot be treated obviously as marginal.
Okay, so Andrzej, if I understand well, the destruction of cultural heritage just show us that the war is even more brutal, or that there are some evil intentions behind the whole hostilities, that we could talk about that because of the destruction of cultural heritage, we could learn about the reasons of the attackers. And I know that, Katerina, you did deal with the problem of genocide, whether we can use the definition of genocide in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. Do you consider that these kinds of destruction, which we can observe in Ukraine, indicates on this what Andrzej just mentioned, that the intention could be to commit genocide against? And now the question, against who? Because on the one side, we could hear from the Russian authorities that they deny the existence of the separate Ukrainian nation. So what kind of culture is attacked? Who is attacked, according to you, when we talk about the destruction of cultural heritage in Ukraine?
Dzień dobry, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the solidarity of the Polish people and the Polish academic community with us. I would like to contextualize probably, or to put the response to your question, Patricia, in a more human dimension. Just 2 days ago, when we had an unparalleled shelling of Kiev, one of the buildings that was destroyed was the National Academy of Arts, named after Mikhailo Boychuk, a Ukrainian painter of the early 20th century, who at that time in the 1930s was part of the so-called executed Renaissance, the huge number of artists, writers, intellectuals who were executed by the Soviets. And it was to the execution of such people that Raphael Lemkin, in his essay on the Soviet genocide in Ukraine, referred as the evidence of the extermination, what he called the soul of the nation. So I think we should really connect the targeting of the physical objects with the targeting of the bearers of culture, of the idea of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation. And actually, as we look at all existing 4 so far reports of the UN Commission of Inquiry, at the 2 most recent reports of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, we see that they currently single out first the particular targeting of Ukrainians or those people who support Ukraine's independence or serve in Ukrainian armed forces or have been civil society leaders. And second, that these crimes or against these people, they're also connected with the imposition of the Russian culture. So for instance, in detention in the occupied territories, the detainees are forced to perform to learn and perform a Russian anthem, or they're made to use the Ukrainian books instead of toilet paper. So what I'm just trying to say is that I think we're looking into a very intricate combination of violations against cultural heritage in its material dimension, in its immaterial dimension, because the UN speaks a lot now on the encroachment of the cultural expression in occupied territories. And I think it's a certain vindication of the word that we have received from the ICJ in the recent ruling on one of the 2 cases on the convention, on the third convention. And of course, it's also the targeting of the people who are the bearers of culture. That said, and I will get to the genocidal to the response about genocide question in a second. I just wanted to say that even before the full-scale invasion in 2020 and 2021, when we, and by we, I mean the Office of the Prosecutor General and a number of human rights NGOs, when we were preparing the first communication alleging a crime against humanity of persecution committed by Russia in occupied Crimea, we used crimes affecting both cultural heritage and civic activists as those indicating Russia's persecutorial policy. Now, since the full-scale invasion, as far as I'm aware, both Ukraine's investigators and prosecutors, as well as the leading human rights organizations, are assembling their arguments how the targeting of particular museums, how the removal of particular archives and their preservation in Russia, and the destruction of certain archives that are indicative of Ukraine's, for instance, independence movement or ideas about sovereignty and independence, how that can be indicative of a genocidal intent. But I think what's is a positive development, and I'll be concluding here, is that increasingly more both Ukraine's Office of the Prosecutor General as well as the civil society, they become more sober in terms of the language of genocide. So they're assembling the evidence, they're building the cases, but I think for the better, they're just a bit more cautious with the terminology now. And how the upcoming cases pan out, that is up for us to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina. And we can also explain to our listeners and to our participants that, yes, when we talk about the definition of genocide, genocide talks about physical destruction of certain groups, national, ethnic, racial, or religious. So there was the proposition to include within the definition of genocide also cultural genocide, and this proposition was rejected. However, still, as it was stressed by Andrzej, and also you could hear from the speech of Katerina, the destruction of cultural heritage could be a proof of this special intent which you need to prove. For what reason you are killing people, why you are killing those people. And I think, Katerina, that it is worth stressing what you've just said, that the forcing people, for example, to sing, to say Russian anthem, and at the same time destroy the symbols of their own culture is a kind of violation of their dignity. This is a humiliation, and it really it's really outrages the public opinion in Ukraine, which shows that this question of cultural issues issues are extremely important for the people living in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. Joe, because you published a book about cultural heritage and human rights, maybe you could also explain us, because Andrzej just told us that the destruction of cultural heritage could be considered as a violation of human rights. But what kind of human rights? What kind of human rights we can mention in relation to the destruction of cultural heritage?
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and to the Institute for inviting me to participate today. And I'm only sorry that I wasn't able to join you in person in Warsaw. Yeah, your question is an incredibly important one, and I can build, I think, on some of Andrzej's comments on this. I mean, when we are denying people access to their cultural heritage, where there is a scenario where groups are being prevented from exploring their own traditional practices, from expressing themselves in their own indigenous language, where they are being prevented from expressing themselves through art, through speech, through writing, through whatever medium it might be, we are imperiling a variety of fundamental human rights, not just the right to culture and the right to access and participation in culture, but also denial of freedom of association, freedom of expression, and also at times as you know, freedom to participate in democratic processes can also be a knock-on effect of denial of access to culture. And fundamentally, at the root cause of this is the denial of equality. We are discriminating against particular groups and denying them access to the culture. So these forms of violations really at the heart, not only of civil and political rights, but also of economic, social, and cultural rights. So there's no, I can't say there is a small package of rights that are violated when heritage is destroyed or attacked. It is a whole panoply of rights that are imperiled. And if I could also just go back to your question you asked, Andrzej, in terms of whether or not we should be talking about this at all. It's something which I have encountered quite frequently in The Hague, where I'm joining you from today, particularly when it comes to whether or not heritage destruction should be the subject of individual criminal responsibility. And often there is some association between monuments or bricks and mortar or tangible objects, and saying that, well, their destruction is abhorrent, it is disappointing, but ultimately it's not the same as harm that is inflicted directly on human beings. And I think it's important that, and I think we're seeing it, a change in mentality around this, that because a site of cultural heritage or tangible cultural heritage, be it movable or immovable, is attacked, can have profound physical consequences for people. It can inflict profound mental suffering on whole groups of people. And in the conflict in Ukraine, heritage destruction is central to this armed conflict. It was central to its abuse as a pretext for the use of force by the Russian Federation, who claimed completely fallaciously, in my mind, to the extent that there is absolutely no evidence for this, that those persons who identify as Russian in the Donbass region were being denied access to their cultural heritage, or denied access to their language and so on. And this was deemed to be a genocidal act, as according to the Russian Federation. It was a complete abuse of the obligation to prevent under the 1948 Convention. And this is something which Ukraine, I think, very importantly, is pursuing before the International Court of Justice, where they're seeking a judgment which will vindicate them and make clear that this accusation is not truthful, is completely false. But once the full-scale invasion occurred, from day one, we were seeing direct attacks on cultural heritage. We're seeing it now today. We're seeing it every day of this conflict. It's not incidental. It is central to it, is my main point. Thanks.
And Joe, because you do the research concerning the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflicts, do you think that these attacks against cultural goods and also, as Katerina stressed, also bearers of culture, it's something, this is as usual with what we can observe in the armed conflicts, or this is very specific for this conflict?
It's certainly not unique to this conflict. I would say that it is very rare, in fact, that you would have an armed conflict which does not involve a significant degree of cultural heritage destruction in it. Obviously, there may be exceptions to that, but when you have two groups that are opposed to one another, where you have a level of vitriol and hatred which is being expressed through political leadership, through media sources, it is inevitable that in the heat of battle, that there will be an attempt or there will be a concerted effort to attack those aspects of identity which the opposing party hold quite dear. It has a variety of consequences. In particular, it has very significant consequences for the morale of the opposing party. If you're destroying their places of worship, if you're destroying their places of artistic expression, it has this knock-on effect of giving the impression that they are slowly being eradicated, that they are slowly being pushed out of the territory that they are occupying. So it is a very common feature of armed conflict. We saw it in the Balkans. We've seen it throughout the ISIS campaign in the Maghreb and in the Levant. There has been in recent years no shortage of examples of heritage destruction being a key foundation upon which armed conflict is waged.
And coming back to Katerina, because you just explained us that this destruction could be linked with the genocidal intent, but you know what is the approach in Ukraine, you could observe it. And do you think that this tactic could be effective? Because those examples which just Joe mentioned prove that those groups didn't stop to exist, that of course they do remember about those attacks, and this can raise hatred, you know, that it can even provoke further conflicts. But from your point of view, Katerina, do you think that this tactic, which was adopted by Russian armed forces, by Russian authorities, could be effective?
Thank you. I just wanted to add a little specification. I totally agree with you concerning cultural genocide and the fact that it hasn't been criminalized the way it was initially envisaged by Raphael Lemkin. But I think the whole discussion about the targeting of heritage is really important to assessing another component, the destruction in whole or in part. Because I think the main argument which we received, again, from Raphael Lemkin was that to destroy a nation, to destroy a group, do you really have to destroy every single person? Or is it the targeting of the specific bearers, not just of the culture, but of the values, of the vision for the future? And here, again, I think it's so important to see how Russia's targeting, for instance, of certain cultural objects, especially initially, for instance, the churches of the Orthodox Kiev Patriarchy churches in Crimea, or the mosques of the Crimean Tatars who refused to cooperate with Russia, how that also correlated with the crimes affecting those particular persons, the Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars on the peninsula who opposed the occupation.
Thank you. We need to also make a certain distinction that when we talk about the destruction of cultural heritage, we can talk about the destruction which is a result of the direct hostilities, so the attacks against buildings, the attacks against people, but also we have the situation when the aggressor takes control over the part of the territory, it starts to occupy this territory. And then having the control over this territory, it has another tools to abuse the cultural heritage of the people living there. So Andrzej, could you tell us what is going on in the occupied territories? Do you observe some scale of pillage, or maybe there is no pillage? How you assess the situation?
Okay. So this is, I think, a very important question, because when we think about hostilities, obviously, usually during the war, there will be always some damage to build heritage, to material culture. This is obvious, but taking the material culture, removing from the territory, from the occupied territory, is a different issue. And as you mentioned, Patricia, because here we are in the phase of this occupying administration by Russia of different regions. Also, we need to remember that this is the question also of Crimea. Crimea, not only from 2022, but from 2014. So this is a longer occupation and longer time of looting. And obviously, what is looting? Because also obviously in the history of war, on the history of armed conflicts, spoils of war is common throughout human history. However, since at least more than 100 years, it is part of international law that the occupying power has some obligations toward territory that cannot act as a thief, that cannot act as an actor of plunder. And what is happening in Ukraine? So obviously, on the one hand, we've got like a typical pillage, undertaken by soldiers, by different officials. The other thing is the official system of depriving these territories from movable heritage. And there are numbers. So I will start like briefly from Crimea, because this already started 2014, 15, and so on. And there was and also it was not only the takings from the museums to the art that were removed to let's say to main museums in Russia, like the top museums, so including Pushkin, including Hermitage, taking for exhibitions, and to my knowledge, these takings were never, this object were never given back to Crimean institution. So the second also was the question of illicit excavation, and this is really important, because these objects that were discovered, so they were not studied before, and they were usually removed like by force without special or due diligence in doing excavations. So all the history, all the history of different civilizations, different cultures living in that peninsula are basically lost. So this is not only crimes of taking, of removing, but also of destroying like really culture and history of that region, because it is irreparable. You cannot recreate that. So the history is lost. So this one thing. The other, obviously in different museums. So according to Ukrainian sources, maybe Katarina can correct me. It's over 40 museums that were looted in the occupied territories. So for instance, the entire collections from the Kherson Art Museum, the Kherson Regional Museum, and the Kherson Regional Archives were basically emptied. So this is and there are many others. So this may be not time to list all these museums, but I would like to emphasize that this is not just by chance that some decision by the military commander, by some administrator from Russia administrating that institutions. It is all well organized. So and what is evidence of that? So even today on the list of sanctions, personal sanctions of the EU, we've got a list of curators, of people from museums that were involved in plundering of cultural property, cultural objects, archives from occupied territories in Ukraine. So this is something organized that very often we can compare to the organized plunder by Nazi regime. So if you think that people were prepared to go and to take objects to remove them from that museums and remove them from occupied territory. So this is not something accidental. This is not something that happened during the war. It is something organized, and this is really scary. So and also some collections are taken to the big museums in main Russia, let's say the big cities of Russia, but some also are taken to Crimea to again the occupied territory of Crimea. So they move from eastern Ukraine and move to Crimea. So this is really serious, and I think that we've got more and more evidences of that organized plunder. And to conclude, the other thing that we need to also remember that is very much also important for the EU, for neighboring countries, is the question of illicit trade. So some objects can be traded. So those pillaged not without like an organized system, but are removed for the market purposes. And we also need to see these two different aspects.
Yes, and we can also remind that the question of looting and also this illegal trade of cultural artifacts, we could observe also in other armed conflicts. And even we have the resolutions of the Security Council, which indicated that this trade with the cultural heritage could sometimes fuel the armed conflicts. Yeah, that we need to be very sensitive to those issues. Joe, but from your perspective, when we talked about different examples of destruction of cultural heritage, looting cultural heritage, but do you think that the current state of law is prepared for the protection of cultural heritage during the armed conflict? Do we have sufficient tools to protect cultural heritage during armed conflict?
I certainly think we do. The one area I think which is somewhat lacking is with regard to enforcement, both of obligations on the level of state responsibility, but also on the level of individual criminal responsibility. So, I mean, from my own perspective, I'm predominantly an international criminal lawyer. I focus predominantly on violations of international humanitarian law and the issue of crimes against humanity. And when I look at the available sort of resources within international criminal law, say, for instance, with regards to the International Criminal Court and the Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, actually the availability of sanctions under the Rome Statute in terms of the scope of heritage destruction that is prosecutable under the Rome Statute is relatively limited. And I think that is something which is quite regrettable, actually. So, for instance, under Article 8 of the Rome Statute, which is the provision which deals with war crimes, it is a war crime to direct attacks against cultural property. But there is no provision that deals specifically with cultural heritage given in its diversity of forms. So we're limited under Article 8 to destruction of immovable cultural property. So the types of acts that Andre was mentioning there in terms of theft, looting, illegal trade, and profiting for the purposes of sustaining the armed conflict, for instance, would not be something that the International Criminal Court could easily prosecute. Similarly, if we're talking about the impact of the destruction of intangible cultural heritage, so in circumstances which we've already discussed this evening of denial of access to cultural traditions, denial of access and use of languages, that is something, again, which the Rome Statute will struggle to provide an accountability mechanism for, which is in sort of contrast to the fact that we have well-established instruments under international cultural heritage law, such as the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, which set down certain safeguarding processes and procedures which states are obligated to follow. So in ICL, we're limited, but outside of that, there are more tools. There are some definite avenues there which are being utilized. For instance, on the intangible, the intangible front, the Ukrainian government were very successful in having the Ukrainian borscht tradition being inscribed and provided safeguarding under the 2003 convention. It was a very important moment in that particular context. And we're seeing other aspects of the heritage regime in international law having some impact and kicking into gear. What I think as well is particularly important are initiatives such as those that both Andrea and Katerina were involved in, such as their report for the EU Cult Committee on the nature and extent of the heritage destruction in Ukraine. These sorts of initiatives lay down and set out for the uninformed where the law is, what the law is, and what it provides for, and then provides guidance on what can be done and what steps can be taken to further protect heritage that is in danger, but also to seek accountability for violations of state obligations under international law. So these initiatives by the EU, but also the initiatives like the Institute is undertaking to raise awareness, to let people know that this is not an area which is unregulated, that is not subject to international norms, but actually is something which has quite a rapidly maturing body of law that is available to states and practitioners, including domestic courts and international courts, I think is a very important initiative to be engaged in.
Joe, but you also mentioned those limitations of international criminal law. But we do remember that one of the very known and famous case, which was dealt by the International Criminal Court, did consider the question of the destruction of cultural heritage. I'm talking about the case of Al-Mahdi. And also we know that in the strategy of the prosecutor, the question of the protection of cultural heritage sometimes appear. We know also that in case of Ukraine, we already have a few arrest warrants issued against several people, including President Vladimir Putin. But those arrest warrants, they were concerning the crimes like deportation of children and currently the attacks against civilian buildings and disproportional attacks. Do you think, having in mind the context of hostilities in Ukraine, that maybe this would be also a very good signal to also initiate proceeding concerning destruction of cultural heritage? Or do you think that it is less probable, having in mind that we had Al-Mahdi case, the signal was sent, we don't need any more?
Yeah. The Al-Mahdi case is one of, I suppose, the few undisputed success stories for the International Criminal Court. Much ink has been expended talking about the significance of the Al-Mahdi case. But in truth, it was significant because it was a case which was focused exclusively on the destruction of cultural heritage in Timbuktu, the destruction of mausoleums in particular. The issue, though, with Al-Mahdi is that he pleaded guilty. So it was a very straightforward case, and it was one where those of us interested in the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict were really hoping that it would be a case that would explore sort of the gaps and the sort of intricacies within the Rome Statute dealing with heritage destruction. But once Al-Mahdi expressed his remorse and accepted the charges against him, that opportunity was more or less gone. So in terms of what Al-Mahdi contributed to the development of the law, I would say it's relatively limited. It made an important contribution with regards to reparations for destruction of cultural heritage and the judgment of the court, where it conceptualized the nature of harm that arises from heritage destruction, is very important. Making statements about the fact that it is a crime not only against the identity of the directly affected population, but also against the nation of Mali, but also against the international community and humanity as a whole, I think was an important statement of principle. Now, in terms of whether or not this will be it for the ICC and heritage destruction, I very much hope that that is not the case. On the back of the Al-Mahdi judgment and case, we had the publication in 2021 of the Office of the Prosecutor's policy on cultural crimes against cultural heritage. And in that document, the prosecutor indicates the prioritization of investigating crimes attacking culture at every stage of the prosecutor's activities. So from the earliest stages of the investigation right through to the prosecution of cases, there will be a close attention to crimes against cultural heritage. Now, whether or not that will now be followed through on remains to be seen. I certainly think there is ample evidence that would form the basis of a case, but also would maybe replicate the case law of the Yugoslavia Tribunal, where charges relating to heritage destruction were a relatively common feature because they were used in the context of the crime against humanity of persecution. So where you could show that there was a discriminatory link between the destruction of cultural property and the denial of fundamental rights on discriminatory grounds, you have the crime against humanity of persecution. Now, the charges that have been set down so far against Mr. Putin and most recently, a couple of weeks ago, against Kobylash and Sokolov, I think are quite interesting. You pointed out that they were for targeting civilian objects and civilian infrastructure. So these are specifically related to sort of targeting choices and decisions that were made by both the Air Force, the Russian Air Force, and the naval forces. I thought it was a little bit curious that there was not, at least within the press release, the arrest warrant is, or the arrest warrants are still confidential. We only have the bare bones understanding of the evidence and of the charges. But I was somewhat surprised to see that that particularly for these two individuals, that targeting and attacks on cultural property under Article 8 was not included as a charge. That's not to say that these charges won't be laid in separate cases against different individuals who are perhaps more easily or more directly linked with the destruction of cultural property. But I think given the centrality of heritage destruction and denial of Ukrainian identity, I think it would be quite unexpected if we didn't have, in some cases, charges relating to heritage destruction. I would be very surprised. But yeah, we wait and see. But just on the domestic front, I think it's important, if I can just make this point, to talk about the fact that we had an important conference a couple of weeks ago, the Uniting for Justice, Uniting for Heritage conference, which was a major international conference, which also had the participation of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group for Ukraine. And there we had a presentation from Prosecutor Kostin, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, who made in very clear terms statements around the significance of heritage destruction for the activities of his office. He indicated that there are currently 60 investigations undergoing or underway into crimes relating to cultural heritage, and that it is something which very much is a priority domestically, at least. And that is, of course, something to emphasize. The ICC is merely one avenue, and perhaps not even the most effective avenue for accountability. And I think it's very significant that domestically, Ukraine is certainly not ignoring these crimes and is going to be pursuing justice where it can.
Yes, and it is worth emphasizing that maybe we should not count on the international courts, which have limited powers, also limited resources, and they can just pick a few cases, while the main burden should be on the shoulders of national courts, not only of Ukraine, because we do remember that, as Joe pointed out, that the attacks against cultural goods, these are war crimes, which are covered by the jurisdiction of all states in the world, having in mind the content of Geneva Conventions of 1949. And coming back to the legal framework, because yes, we also have specific conventions devoted to the protection of cultural goods. We have the Hague Convention of 1954 with 2 additional protocols. But we also know that the protection of cultural goods is limited whether, for example, those goods are used for military purposes. And still, we would have problem that sometimes they could be just the destruction of cultural goods could be a result of collateral damage, and we could not prosecute anyone for this kind of destruction. But also we know that from those Hague Conventions and its protocols that some goods could be covered by this special protection, or as it is called, enhanced protection. And it could be quite surprising for us that on the UNESCO enhanced protection list, there are no Ukrainian sites mentioned. And Andrzej, do you think that this is a mistake? What is the problem? And maybe within this legal framework could be done something more to protect cultural goods in Ukraine.
Okay. So under the regime of international humanitarian law, under the Hague regime of as you mentioned, of the 1954 and 2 protocols, obviously there are 3 different levels of protection. So the enhanced is the highest one, and was especially established in light of terrible crimes committed in Yugoslavia. So it was from 1999. So basically after a number of crimes committed against culture, broadly culture of and cultural life and cultural identity of people of Yugoslavia, and what is the regime is basically based on a special register by UNESCO that states can propose, nominate certain sites, certain monuments that are considered by the committee UNESCO Committee on the Protection of Cultural Property in event of armed conflict, and why this is important? Because as Patrycja, as you mentioned, there's a question of evidence very often. So whether the attack could not be avoided, basically, like saying in the most simple that was collateral damage, and so on and so forth, or the object was used was too close to the war theater, and so on and so forth. And in this case, these sites that must fulfill 3 different requirements. So must be of greatest importance for the humanity. So this is also like problematic. What is the greatest importance for the humanity? The second, they should enjoy adequate national protection, and finally should not be used for any military purposes. And basically today on this list we've got I think like nearly 30 cultural properties from 12 countries. And you're right, Ukraine is not among them, but obviously we need to think what is the reason, because these obligations, like during the armed conflict, I basically direct to them participating parties in the conflict. So if such a site is attacked under protection, and this protection is not waived, is still enjoys its international status, what happens? So, and here is the importance of the criminal liability, because the attack against such properties is a serious crime under the protocol. So all states parties to the protocol are obliged to prosecute the offenders of such so the actors of such crimes. And also, what is also important here is the so-called universal jurisdiction. So they can they're bound to not only prosecute the situations in which the attack, the destruction happened at their own territory or was committed by their own national, but also in cases when the criminal, irrespective his nationality is present on their territory. So they can, so they are bound to prosecute. They're bound to take action, and it is to close to act against impunity of those criminals. So, but however, but what happened like last year? So in September last year and December, Ukraine managed to inscribe on the provisional enhanced protection. So this is special status granted by UNESCO, by this committee for armed conflict during hostilities. So the states during in attack can ask for such a protection, and also the requirements are less strict. So it must be important for humanity, the site, the monument. The question of national protection is not relevant, let's say, and but it must not be used for military purposes. And Ukraine managed to inscribe in September 20 properties, and in December 5, so it's quite a large number. And what are the consequences? Obviously, the protection show these sites, these monuments enjoy enhanced protection. Now, so the attacks against them will trigger international criminal responsibility of the offenders. So I think this error that you mentioned, that was on the beginning, was corrected last year through the provisional inscription. And so from this point of view, let's see how the prosecutions will go in different countries. Joe mentioned that there are over 60 in Ukraine, but obviously probably we might have different cases in other countries based on that provision of the second protocol.
Yeah, and maybe we also need to stress that you can put whatever, maybe not whatever, but you can put many sites on the list. But if there is a evil intention, if you want to commit a crime, listing on any kind of list would not protect those sites. Yeah. So and also we need to stress, and Joe also mentioned this, that maybe we should not focus only on criminal responsibility, but there are also other tools like state responsibility and the question of sanctions. You, Andrzej, mentioned that, for example, curators who were involved in the looting were included on the sanction list. So we also need to think about the tools which we usually use in case of the state responsibility. We cannot exclude even, for example, the use of the International Court of Justice, because I would refer, Joe, to your previous words when you said that sometimes this could be also considered as a violation, for example, of Convention against any racial discrimination or other human rights violations. And why I'm stressing this, because the human rights, the violations of human rights, these are violations of norms which are known in international law as erga omnes norms, which means that all states which are parties to those treaties, they could start the case concerning violation of these kind of cases. But yes, you did mention, Joe, and you, Andrzej, also referred to this, that national Ukrainian courts, they do deal with the destruction of cultural heritage. But that I wanted to ask Katerina, from your perspective, what kind of other steps are undertaken or could be undertaken by Ukrainian authorities to protect cultural goods during this armed conflict?
Thank you. If I may, I'll first respond to your question about the domestic steps, and then we'll make a couple of interventions on the points discussed by the colleagues. Look, I think I need to clarify first why the inscription initiatives were so slow and unsuccessful during the first phase of the war. Russia's aggression started in 2014, as Andrzej has reminded us all, and again, although Ukraine has been benefiting from immense support and attention since the full-scale invasion, it was not the case during the first phase of the war. So that provision for the enhanced protection that requires the state to demonstrate that objects are adequately, particularly protected already domestically for them to be inscribed on an enhanced protection list, there was a strong doubt domestically in Ukraine that first, we could demonstrate that enhanced protection pursuant to the best international standards, and also given the the attitude to Russia's conduct in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, and in Crimea during the first phase of the war, and like the blurring of Russia's presence there, that it will play against Ukraine, and that the inscription will not get enough support. So this at least the description of how the thinking was before the full-scale invasion. Now, I think it's great that at least the Ukrainian civil society has more discussion about prevention, and generally how we could speak about prevention in general and with respect to cultural heritage and safeguarding in times of the ongoing hostilities. There is, I would say, quite a skeptical discussion about the marking, which still should be done, but even that, the putting of the protective emblems on all cultural heritage sites, what size they should be to be deemed effective, that discussion is still ongoing and there. In the same vein, there is an outreach from heritage professionals, both to investigators and prosecutors and journalists, to say that when an attack against a cultural heritage object happens, it's also important to try and be balanced as much as one can be in the coverage. So, for instance, the outrage was, of course, understandable during the immense initial shelling during the beginning of the first full-scale invasion, and many of such attacks would be called straight away as the targeted destruction, whereas as we see later, it doesn't excuse Russia's behavior, but the problem is that Russia oftentimes uses imprecise weapons. So even the legal qualification that it wasn't necessarily in each single case the targeted destruction, for instance, of a cultural heritage object, but it was the use of imprecise weapons or the poor compliance or disregard for the principle of distinction. I think this nuance in the coverage is gradually there, both from the Ukrainian criminal justice sector in their public communication about the shelling, as well as from journalists and human rights NGOs. It's also commendable that the UN Commission of Inquiry, as I mentioned, for the first time has expressly paid more attention to cultural heritage crimes on the basis of their engagement with Ukrainian investigators, prosecutors, and human rights NGOs. The UN Commission of Inquiry has specifically pointed out an attack on Odessa city center, which is on the UNESCO World Heritage List, and they haven't analyzed both the coverage of the attack and the use of weapons. They have said that it was an indiscriminate attack, as well as another group of violations that the UN Commission of Inquiry has specifically singled out is the unsanctioned transfer of cultural objects, especially from the formerly occupied areas in Kherson, Zaporizhia regions. So I think what is great is that there's more sensitivity in the categorization of these crimes and Russia's intention from the Ukrainian side, as well as more attention from international partners. And here I come to the certain points I wanted to make for concerning the interventions made by colleagues. I think, yes, it's important to remember about the policy paper from the ICC OTP about cultural heritage, but also even in the earlier policy papers on case selection and prioritization, the Office of the Prosecutor said that crimes affecting heritage had been historically under-investigated and under-prosecuted. And I think what we are noticing now, and hopefully where Ukraine will also get certain traction, is that the ICC, for instance, in the pending another Mali case of Al-Hassan, it's looking at the intersection of crimes affecting heritage with gender persecution and persecution on other grounds. I think, again, because there seems to be more attention from the ICC prosecutor to the intersectionality and intersectional harms and intersectional motives in atrocity crimes, we might see more discussion of how, again, heritage crimes are connected with the gender dimension of atrocities or with other discriminatory dimensions within the crime of persecution. And another dimension relevant for Ukraine, I think, is that the deportation of Ukrainian children is accompanied by targeted, well-organized indoctrination. It has been commented a lot by UN Commission of Inquiry, by the UN agencies, by human rights NGOs. And perhaps again, because we don't know how well, hopefully the investigations and the prosecutions are going to pan out with the issue of child deportations, but the issues of cultural identity, cultural expressions, the adjacent human rights dimensions, cultural rights dimensions will be discussed in the cases concerning children's deportation. And finally, one thing that we, I think, find difficult to discuss, but from cultural figures and curators being on sanctions lists, it's also the role and the implication of academics. My perhaps most favorite, sadly favorite, striking example would be of the director of the Hermitage Museum, one of the leading museums in the world and in Russia, Professor Mikhail Piotrovsky, and he said, "Мы все милитаристы и имперцы." For those who don't speak Russian, it translates as that we are all militants and we are all imperialists. So essentially, he gave an interview by which he supported the special military operation, the euphemism President Putin uses against Ukraine, and being the head of the main museum in Russia, and also being the dean of the Faculty of Oriental Studies of St. Petersburg University, a member of the board of the Russian Academy of Sciences and the president of the Union of Museums of Russia, Professor Piotrovsky has expressly also endorsed what he had called a special cultural military operation, meaning that it was his coverage essentially for the so-called return or protection of Ukraine's cultural heritage from the areas under Russia's de facto control to Russia. And at numerous exhibitions, not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but across Russia, where they exhibit the artifacts brought from Ukraine, Piotrovsky again very openly endorses all these policies and the connection and the continuity and like the indispensable part that these objects play in Russia's cultural heritage and in their National Museum Fund. And this is just the most striking examples. For instance, the Crimea Center for Strategic Studies tracks not only the removal of cultural heritage, but they also track the publications of Russian scholars and especially the members of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And there have been quite a few publications of such scholars released in Western academic journals discussing the archaeological excavations in occupied Crimea. And I think it also raises the wider questions, first about the decency and academic integrity of those Russian scholars, but also the editorial policies, the review policies of international reputable journals that should do a little bit of a better work in terms of assessing what articles they accept for the publications. Thank you.
Katerina, yes, you did mention many things because it's not only responsibility of Ukraine, it's also responsibility of other states. It's also responsibility of civil society, of the academics, of different people. You just shown how this issue of war crimes can really touch different areas. But also you did stress one more thing, which is, I think, very important for every state, including our own state, Poland, the preparation for the armed conflict. When you say that, for example, there were those internal problems, how to list, how to efficiently protect, according to national law, the cultural goods to be able to list them on the enhanced list. But at the same time, when you said that there is a discussion how big emblems should be, the emblems which should indicate the cultural goods, and probably when you would go now from our debate through the old city of Warsaw, you would see those white blue shields on different buildings. Definitely this is not the size of the emblem which would be helpful in the protection of those goods during the armed conflict. And this kind of discussion is good to have before the conflict than during the conflict, where there are many different problems. But still, the question also appears, what other states, especially states of European Union to which we belong, can do for the protection of cultural goods. And Andrzej, as you were also, together with Katerina, if I remember well, the author of the report, maybe you could mention what is possible for other states which are not directly military engaged in armed conflict, but still can have some obligations, legal and moral ones.
Okay, so basically, like to make it short in terms of obligations, because obviously we mentioned before that international humanitarian law is basically for the parties to the conflict, but however non-participating actors have indeed some obligations, and this is on the so basically, so I will start from the like my basic points to monitor how the situation evolved, how the humanitarian law is followed, by the parties to the conflict. So from this point of view, what can be done? Obviously, it is, I think, very important today, looking at the looking at the practice of international and domestic tribunals, also the question of digital evidence. The evidence so we think that to understand the scale, to understand the issues of inventorying of damages. So this is the first point. The second, obviously, is to provide direct and direct support, financial and technical, and I think this happening. So from during the works on that report, we talk with many organizations, also with many states, and the representatives involved in direct support. So in terms of providing necessary material to store the objects, to shelter them during the air raids, and so on and so forth. So this is also, these practical things are also very important. But from the but you ask about what the EU can. So in this respect, so here obviously the question is that from our studies, it resulted that coordination of this action is not the best, because there are number of NGOs involved. It very much depends on national policies, national structure for humanitarian aid, and so on and so forth. So this was problematic because it was not homogeneous in throughout the EU, and also coordination between offices was not the best, at least when we were writing this report. The other thing that also proposed by the head author of the report, by Dr. Evelyn Kampfens, in her different research, also published by European Parliament last year on the looted art, she suggested the creation of new agency by the EU, so for to coordinate different actions. So taking the mandate from the dispersed, fragmented units of the Commission, especially Commission, and creating new agency with especially vis-a-vis its threats, because Ukraine is the one, but obviously Nagorno-Karabakh is another at the moment in terms of illicit trade, and obviously and there are many others. So to create like a more coordinated policy of the Union, and with the better institutional support. The other thing that I think it's crucial, it's also the struggle against illicit trade, and today, and this is also one of the major tasks of the Union. Also, this is obligation under the Hague regime, so it's obligation under first protocol to the Hague Convention. So in cases when the object originated from the occupied territories, after the end of the occupation or the end of hostilities, should be back to the place, to the country, the place of origin. And this is an obligation, and this is basically nearly, I think today we can also say this is customer obligation of international law to do that. But it's very important to provide a good control, a good coordination, also with proper dialogue with Ukrainian services in this regard, and here states and the EU must be more prudent in terms of provenance research. This is a really key issue when we talk about struggle against illicit trade. And finally, the final point, I think, because we can find different levels, but obviously is the question very much linked to my first point. So the evidence and the efficient prosecution of offenders. No? So this is, and on the one hand, and also I think that the sanction, the personal sanctions of the EU and also by single member state and other countries, as it happens in case of Canada and US, against also those people who are responsible, as Katarina mentioned, for academics, for those involved in illicit excavations, and also for the museum curators. I think also this should be taken more seriously, because for the moment, Katarina, the list is very short. No? For the moment of those people, and we've got evidence, as you mentioned, that there are many people involved, and we've got like a solid evidences that were supporting these crimes against heritage in Ukraine.
We also open our floor for the questions. If they are in the room, we also encourage our online participants. If somebody would like to ask the question, just give me the signal and I will give you the floor. In the meantime, I think that we need to also one more thing stress, why we as Poland, but also Pilecki Institute, which deals with the totalitarian regimes, is so interested in the protection of cultural goods and also potential cases concerning destruction of cultural heritage. We can remind that this was also one of the Polish initiatives during World War II to focus on the destruction of cultural heritage. And we, for example, within the United Nations War Crimes Commissions, there were many claims made by, many submissions made by Poland in which we indicated on the policy of the destruction of cultural heritage, and we were fighting for the recognition of the destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. So of course, now we are in 2024, and unfortunately still these kind of war crimes are happening, but we have more tools to address them. Now the point is to really use them if there is a will on behalf of the state. And Andrzej, just to referring to your questions concerning those obligations of the third state, you are right that the Hague Conventions, Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, they are binding for the state parties, and they are, well, they are relevant especially for those states which are parties to the conflict. However, we need to remember that Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions and additional protocol do stress that states have obligation not only to respect those obligations, those rights, but also to ensure respect, which means that states are obliged to react to violations. And as a maybe interesting trivia from another case, we could observe an interesting development when, for example, Nicaragua just sued Germany in the International Court of Justice for not fulfilling this obligation to ensure respect by, in this case, Israel, of the international humanitarian law. I see the question, so please give the floor to our colleague in the back, please. We need to give you micro, just that everybody would hear you.
Hello. So I wanted to ask two questions, really, and some of the topics you already mentioned, that when how to prevent the destruction of cultural heritage in the sense that if the arts are able to be moved out of the area that is in conflict, are they being moved or are they not? Is that the practice? And if they are moved, who decides when they are moved back? Because there are like in museums that we know and we've seen in Berlin or in Great Britain are things that are from places that already are said to be at peace, and they're not moved back there. So when and how, and yeah, I think that's it.
Joe, Katerina, Andrzej, who would like to, I know that Andrzej definitely dealt with this problem of the loans to the museum and what to do later, but maybe we could also hear our colleagues. What is your opinion on that point? Just give me a signal if someone wants to go. Yes, Katerina, please.
Thank you. I could start with the Ukrainian context. Well, first, just to say that the 1954 Hague Convention, which we mentioned today, it does provide an obligation of an occupying party to cooperate with a state to which the territory belongs on the issues of cultural heritage. So, for instance, the justification that Russia has been using, that they have been removing certain objects for the safety reasons, it doesn't really work out because they never engaged with Ukraine and they never responded neither to Ukraine's or to other institutions, including the UN or the UN Commission of Inquiries about the human rights situation, as well as the heritage issues. From the Ukrainian perspective, I think no country would be prepared for that amount of crimes in terms of protection and prosecution straight away. I think for any system, it would be overwhelming. Whether Ukraine could be protected better in terms of the evacuation plans, for sure. Whether Ukraine could be protected better by mere having, at the very least, the digitalized database of its collections, because many databases of the specific museum collections are still on paper in these huge, like ancient books. And that is why that, in a way, has both enabled the looting and made it more difficult to prosecute and to draft claims about the number of objects that have been relocated. I think the question which you raised with the Western museums is an interesting one, because I think the majority, they rarely refer to the justification that the objects were moved for the purposes of preserving them against the war. It was usually moved during the colonial times. And the counter arguments that certain museums are trying to give now is that first, the conditions for the preservation of these objects are much better or as great as it can be in their museums, A, and B, that everybody can access them. So if such, for instance, artifacts are exhibited at the museums with, for instance, free entry or certain days it's for free. This, of course, is changing, and we have seen the moves from France or Germany in returning certain objects. But in general, I think we should distinguish the apparently unlawful relocation that has happened in breach of the existing international treaties in the ongoing armed conflicts, the way we see between Ukraine and Russia, and the removal of cultural objects, which is also unlawful, but which happened during the colonial times. I just think that the sources breached, the treaty and customary sources, as well as the redress avenues, they're slightly different in these cases, although I don't doubt that redress should be in both cases. And I think here also the Ukrainian situation will be interesting, because currently Ukraine is increasingly arguing for the return not just of those artifacts that have been removed during the ongoing armed conflict, but also for the artifacts that were removed by Soviet and Imperial Moscow, allegedly for the preservation. Or we have many instances when authentic Ukrainian shrines, for instance, will be destroyed by the Soviets, and then the Soviets, before that, actually, they would remove the most precious mosaics or frescoes from these shrines to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. And I think this is the issue where Ukraine's partners, especially the former colonial powers, will feel very uneasy, because in the way, if they support Ukraine's claim, that would give stronger argument to also demand that they return the objects that they had taken during the colonial times back. So I think it's a much more intricate discussion, but of course it should happen increasingly more about the return of the objects removed during the colonial times. Thank you.
And Andrzej?
I think this was a really important question that was really dealt at the level of the UN Security Council, and also with much discussion actually. But let me start like briefly from one case. So maybe Katarina and Joe can correct me, because this case involves Ukraine and Netherlands concerning so-called Crimea gold that was on the exhibition in Amsterdam. This was an exhibition organized before the occupation of Crimea, and after the end of exhibition was the question to whom and to where this object should be returned, or to Crimea under occupation by Russian occupation, or to Ukraine. And just recently, as you may know, these objects were returned to Ukraine, not to Crimea. And so I'm not going to deal with the legal litigation, but it's very much with what you are asking. But going back to the UN Security Council, because during the Arab Spring, this idea of creating so-called safe havens was very much discussed, and discussed was in Abu Dhabi in a special forum to create the special fund to protect, to organize extraterritorial safe havens to protect cultural property from the conflict-ridden territories and so on, and the years. The next year, so this was 2016, and in December and in March 2017, UN Security Council issued a very important resolution concerning the preservation of cultural heritage in armed conflict and terrorism, and during the discussions at the Security Council, Egypt said no, there is no our consent to include in the text of resolution by the UN the proposal to create extraterritorial safe havens, because we had bad experience in the past. And this was very important. So at the end, if you look carefully at the content of that resolution, is to create shelters, but it is meant more on the territory of the state in armed conflict, not outside the national territory, because there was a very strong opposition from Egypt, and I think it's very also in line with what Katarina said, that this experience of colonialism really affects present day solutions when we talk about armed conflicts.
So for the question to move or not to move, it's better not to move. And I also have one question from our online participant to Joe. Joe, the question is, how would you comment the ICC rather low sentence awarded to the Al-Mahdi case? In Al-Mahdi case, why this sentence was, in comparison to other war crimes prosecution, so low?
Well, I mean, that's an excellent question. It goes to, there's an issue generally in international criminal law that we don't have what are called sentencing guidelines. So in many domestic jurisdictions, there will be a handbook available to judges where they have an individual before them who has been convicted of criminal offense X. And in this guideline, there will be an indication of the likely sentence that they should consider for this person. In international criminal law, we have no sentencing guidelines. So we are left in a situation of relying on basically the caprice of the judges who are handing down the sentence. And in terms of understanding how they arrived at that decision, how they arrived at that sentence, we are left really with what they're willing to share in the judgment that they hand down. And often they will go through the aggravating factors, the mitigating factors, and so on. And this is how they arrived at their particular judgment or their particular sentence. But why it was so low, I don't know. Others would say it was quite high. There's actually quite a significant portion of the commentariat who would say 9 years for destruction of mausoleums. That after he pleaded guilty, that seems a bit excessive. And that, again, when you compare to other sentences that have been handed down, like Thomas Lubanga, the first defendant convicted by the ICC for recruitment of child soldiers, received a sentence, if I remember correctly, somewhere in the region of 13 years. You get this inevitable comparison between human harm versus harm directed at physical objects and how you tally the two. The reality, though, I think, is that the judgment in Al-Mahdi was very much a shot in the dark. They had no precedent. This was the first case in ICL history which focused exclusively on destruction of cultural heritage. At the Yugoslavia tribunal, we had heritage destruction prosecuted, but alongside other offences. So this was very much sort of uncharted territory for the judges. It was a guilty plea. So I think there was a clear expression of remorse from Mr. Al-Mahdi. So I think they had significant mitigating factors to consider. But I think if you disagree with it either being too low or too high, I think there are strong arguments that can be made in both directions.
Thank you. And the very last question, we have here, I would give you the mic.
Thank you. Michał Rzechowski, I'm an independent journalist, human rights activist. First will be rather short and simple. Is it because I was late, so I don't know, maybe it was already mentioned, if there is this maybe precise list of this list of the objects destructed and stolen by Russians from Ukraine? And the second is just remark, which will end with the also general question. The organizers they put the photo of the monument of Hetman Sahaidatchny in Kiev with protection sent. I was making a documentary film about the war in Georgia and Ukraine, Casus Belli, when is this war, and we were in Odessa 2022 when there was the first bombardment. And also we've seen near the coastline there is this monument of one of the, I think, French creators of Odessa, also covered completely with the sand bags, and also this very famous stars down to the sea on Pancernik Pationkin, which were like people, and they were making revolution, and now it's completely covered with blockade, barbed wire. They don't want any Russians revolution. It's like opposite. It's very symbolic. And also I support cooperation and Poland with Ukraine. We make some presentation, including Polish Parliament, the feature film about Wasyl Stus, Zaboronony, and he was a very great, brave Ukrainian poet. In Warsaw, there is his monument and also a small square, which is very good to know. But I also have a strange signals from my friends who are Ukrainians, and they are very, very patriotic, that because there is a war and there is also information and propaganda war, they would love to make more and more films about Ukrainian history and culture. But people are just sometimes tired, and it is understandable in Ukraine. And they would love to just see normal films, like, comedies and things. And it's Russia is winning with this propaganda war, because they are just making a lot of just stupid, comedies and things like this. So this is again like a general question, how to best propagate this, because I think it was a very good job that Oscars got this year, this Ukrainian documentary. But it will be like an open question, how this is the best way, to support Ukrainians on this, media, culture, film, propaganda in a good way, level internationally. So first question about very precise, if there is a list of this stolen and destroyed and destroyed things from Ukraine further times and now during this war by Russians. And the second is general question, how to support and what could be put together internationally make better to propagate Ukrainian culture and history.
And we need to think, also stress that your question was also a comment. You know, you also make some indication what is needed to also promote Ukrainian culture.
I'm especially interested in the Ukrainian lady because she knows the best how it's going on.
We just understood that this is the question directed to Katerina. So Katerina, if you can comment on it, we would appreciate a lot.
Yes, thank you very much. As regards to the first question, there is not just a list. There are unfortunately many lists. So even the Ministry of Culture and the government as such has several lists which they publish on the website of the Ministry of Culture. Then there is a separate designated governmental website that lists the damage to cultural heritage. UNESCO also publishes regular updates about attacks on cultural heritage sites as well as on schools and journalists. Human rights NGOs dealing with the documentation of heritage violations have been also publishing their research. And inevitably, sadly, the numbers differ. And I think it just shows that there needs to be more harmonization of the methodology. There should also be less, as I mentioned, direct or ready-made classification that there was a targeted attack on something, because oftentimes it's an indiscriminate attack or the use of imprecise weapons. But just to tell you that there are several registries, both from the government side, from international organizations, and domestic and international human rights NGOs. It's a very interesting question regarding the cultural field, and I would want to make two comments here. I think, like, what I notice, at least in Kiev and Lviv are exceptional because, I mean, apart from occasional shelling, there's so much life-assertive life there as usual. And just this morning I posted a video of a long queue in front of one of the main theaters to buy the tickets for a brilliant performance by Ukrainian classics. So it's really hard to buy tickets to an opera house or the theaters because people are so willing to live their life in a meaningful way, because I think the danger and the fragility of life I've felt so acutely. And what I would say that there is no shortage of the, I don't know, just the usual films or theater or the plays. That said, what I noticed, not even with my so-called bubble of the human rights lawyers, even with the normal Ukrainians, the general public, people don't shy away from difficult issues. I was stunned by how many people went and saw 20 Days in Mariupol. I myself have not been able to do this. I think, and this is responding to how international partners could help, and you in particular, I think spreading the awareness and really inviting people to watch such difficult films as 20 Days in Mariupol is important. But in Ukraine, I've seen that both people willing to watch this and on the contrary saying that we are traumatized too much, we wouldn't want to. But what's interesting, what I have also noticed that Ukraine in late 2023 staged for the first time a woman in Berlin. You might know that this is the anonymous memoir, well, initially anonymous memoir of a woman who suffered and witnessed immense crimes by the Russian army, including mass rapes in Berlin. And I was stunned to realize that both the directors and the actors made this choice to stage a very difficult book, a very difficult play in a theater in Kiev. That said, not only they made that choice, so many people went and saw it, despite the abundance of evidence of essentially the same crimes perpetrated by Russia nowadays now. So I would say that at least now in Ukraine, there's no shortage of a variety of cultural product, and internationally, I think it's important to show also the beautiful pieces that were made, including by the members of the Executed Renaissance and by Ukrainian artists and dissidents like Stus, be that the poetry, the fine art, or the films during the Imperial Soviet and current Russian repressions. But it's equally important to show such films that really document the reality in war-affected Ukraine and Russia's war crimes like 20 Days in Mariupol. Thank you.
Katerina, thank you for this answer, because we are coming back to our first question. even in armed conflicts, we need culture, and the culture is also the response to an armed conflict. And we do hope that we would have to change our expertise and maybe not deal with the protection of culture in the armed conflict. And we wish that all armed conflicts in the world would end very soon. But also your last words, Katerina, shows that even in the most disastrous war, we do hope, and we want to enjoy together the culture, and it's very important for us, and this is what defines us in these difficult times. Thank you for this debate. Thank you for the participation, and see you on another occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much.